The wedding planner looked directly at me, lowered her voice and said, "Mrs. Alina Hayes, I'm so sorry, but your daughter has instructed us that if you arrive on Saturday, security is not to let you inside." For a second, I honestly believed she had mistaken me for someone else. I stared at the neat stack of ivory invitations lying on her desk. My daughter's name, Claire Bennett, was written in elegant gold lettering across the top. I had helped pay for those invitations. I had folded hundreds of birthday cards for that same little girl when she was too young to spell her own name. And now my name wasn't welcome on the guest list. "My name is Alina Hayes," I answered quietly. "I'm Claire's mother." The planner swallowed. "I know." Those two words somehow hurt more than anything else. I nodded once, thanked her for telling me instead of allowing me to discover the truth at the entrance, and walked back to my car without raising my voice. I didn't call Claire. I didn't send an angry message. I didn't tell the rest of the family. Instead, I drove home with the wedding favor samples still sitting on the passenger seat, because only 3 days earlier Claire had asked me which ribbon looked more elegant. Life has a strange way of preparing you for heartbreak long before it finally arrives. My name is Alina Hayes. I'm 64 years old. Most people would describe me as quiet, dependable, and painfully ordinary. But ordinary people sometimes carry extraordinary stories. And mine didn't begin with a wedding invitation. It began more than 40 years earlier, with promises I believed would last forever. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Before we go any further, drop your first name and the city you're watching from in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and become part of a community that understands that sometimes the quietest people carry the deepest scars and the strongest hearts. When I was 12 years old, my father gave me a lesson that shaped almost every decision I made afterward. He worked at the county rail depot for 38 years. Every morning he left the house at exactly 5:10. Every evening he came home with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his shoulders. One afternoon I asked him why he never complained. He smiled and answered, "Because the people I love should never have to carry the weight I'm strong enough to carry." At 12 that sounded noble. At 64 I understand it can also become dangerous. Because if you spend your entire life carrying everyone's burdens, eventually they forget the burden exists. They only notice when you finally put it down. I married David Hayes when I was 23. He wasn't wealthy. Neither was I. Together, we had exactly $1,860 in savings. Our first apartment measured just under 620 square feet. The kitchen table doubled as my sewing station. The living room became David's office whenever he brought work home. Our bedroom ceiling leaked every spring. Yet we were happy. At least I believed we were. Claire arrived 2 years later. She weighed 6 pounds 11 ounces. The hospital bracelet still sits inside my jewelry box. Not because I'm sentimental about objects. Because it reminds me that before children become adults with opinions about your worth, they begin life holding your finger with complete trust. When Claire was 4, she insisted I attend every preschool event. She would search the audience until she found me. If she couldn't see my face, she refused to begin singing. The teachers laughed. Parents thought it was adorable. I simply felt needed. I didn't realize children eventually stop looking for your face. Sometimes they begin hopping no one notices you're there. David's construction company expanded steadily. By the time Claire entered middle school, we had moved into a 2-story home with 4 bedrooms. Nothing extravagant. About 2,700 square feet. Enough room for birthday parties, sleepovers, and Christmas mornings that filled every hallway with wrapping paper. I worked as a bookkeeper for 28 years. My salary wasn't enormous. But I tracked every dollar. Every overtime payment. Every tax refund. By the time Claire graduated high school, we had quietly saved $186,000 toward her education. She never knew the number. Children rarely know the exact mathematics behind sacrifice. They simply assume stability has always existed. Claire was bright. Exceptionally bright. She graduated in the top 5% of her class. Won 2 academic scholarships. Completed a master's degree without needing student loans, because David and I filled every financial gap ourselves. We never called it generosity. We called it parenting. David died unexpectedly when Claire was 27. A heart attack. No warning. One ordinary Tuesday morning, he kissed my forehead before leaving for work. By lunchtime he was gone. People often imagine grief as loud. Mine wasn't. Mine sounded like 1 coffee cup instead of 2. 1 toothbrush. One side of the bed remaining perfectly untouched for years. Claire cried harder than I had ever seen. For nearly 12 months we leaned on each other. Every Sunday she came for dinner. Every holiday she insisted we preserve old traditions. Sometimes she'd rest her head on my shoulder, exactly as she had done when she was 10 years old. Those were the moments I believed nothing fundamental could ever separate us. Looking back now, I realize grief can unite people temporarily without healing whatever already existed beneath the surface. When Claire turned 30, she accepted a marketing executive position in Chicago. Her income nearly doubled within 3 years. She purchased designer handbags I couldn't pronounce. Started traveling internationally for conferences. Learned which restaurants required reservations months in advance. I admired her success. Honestly, watching your child exceed your own achievements should feel like victory. And mostly it did. But little things began changing. Not suddenly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. She corrected how I pronounced certain French menu items. She gently suggested I update my wardrobe. She laughed when I still balanced my checkbook manually instead of using banking apps. None of those moments seemed cruel individually. Together they formed a pattern. One Christmas she handed me 3 department store gift cards. They'll help modernize your closet. I smiled. She smiled. Neither of us acknowledged that every sweater hanging in my closet represented years when every spare dollar had gone toward hers instead. The first time she introduced me to her fiancé, Daniel Bennett, I wanted to like him. He arrived precisely on time. Firm handshake. Expensive watch. Confident posture. 36 years old. Corporate attorney. Partner track. Intelligent. Disciplined. Everything looked impressive on paper. He complimented my cooking. Asked thoughtful questions. Thanked me for dinner. Nothing seemed wrong. Only afterward did I remember something peculiar. Throughout the entire evening, he never asked a single question whose answer wasn't professionally useful. Not one. He knew Claire's promotion timeline. He knew investment strategies. He knew real estate trends. He never asked how David and I met. Never asked about Claire as a child. Never wondered which family traditions mattered. It wasn't arrogance. It was optimization. Every conversation moved toward advantage. Claire seemed fascinated by that quality. She described him as focused, efficient, ambitious. Perhaps he was. But efficiency sometimes leaves very little room for gratitude. My younger sister, Linda, noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. Elena, she said one afternoon while helping me plant tulips, Claire speaks about networking more than people now. I defended my daughter immediately. She's building a career. Linda nodded. I know. Then she said something I couldn't forget. Just don't let her build a life where image becomes more valuable than memory. At the time, I thought Linda was being dramatic. She wasn't. The engagement party took place 18 months later at a downtown rooftop restaurant overlooking the river. About 90 guests attended. Investment bankers, law partners, consultants, Executives. Everyone seemed polished, confident, perfectly dressed. I wore a navy blue dress I'd purchased 8 years earlier because it still fit beautifully. Claire hugged me, but almost immediately whispered into my ear, "Mom, next time maybe something a little more contemporary." She smiled while saying it, softly, as though kindness could erase the meaning. I laughed, pretended not to care. Later that evening, I overheard Daniel speaking with one of his colleagues. He didn't know I was standing just around the corner. "My future mother-in-law is sweet," he said. "Very small town." His colleague chuckled. Daniel continued, "She's the kind of person who still sends handwritten thank you cards." They both laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was dismissive laughter. The kind reserved for people considered charming but irrelevant. I never mentioned overhearing that conversation. Instead, I mailed Daniel a handwritten birthday card 6 months later. He never acknowledged receiving it. Wedding planning began the following spring. Claire called almost daily. "Mom, can you compare these flower samples? Mom, which table setting looks warmer? Mom, could you help organize the guest welcome baskets?" I happily agreed every single time. Over 4 months, I spent nearly 140 hours helping. I assembled invitations, addressed envelopes, packed welcome gifts, called vendors, even baked sample desserts because Claire wanted childhood recipes included during the rehearsal dinner. Every request ended the same way. "I couldn't do this without you." I believed her. Then, about 3 weeks before the ceremony, something shifted. Claire stopped asking my opinion. Instead, she started informing me about decisions already made. She sounded rushed, distracted, almost impatient whenever I spoke. One afternoon, I arrived at the venue, carrying fabric samples she'd specifically requested. As I stepped inside, I heard voices drifting from the ballroom. Claire, Daniel, and Daniel's mother, Victoria. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I simply froze when I heard my own name. "I just don't want Mom making people uncomfortable," Claire said quietly. Victoria replied, "Darling, weddings are about first impressions. Important clients will be there." Daniel answered after a long pause, "I understand what Claire means." Silence followed. Then Claire sighed. "I love her, but sometimes she doesn't realize how she comes across." I stood perfectly still, the fabric samples trembling slightly in my hands, while the rest of the conversation faded beneath the pounding of my own heartbeat. I could have walked into the ballroom that very second. I could have laughed awkwardly and pretended I had heard nothing. Or I could have demanded an explanation. Instead, I quietly turned around, carried the fabric samples back to my car and drove home. About 40 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Claire. "Mom, where are you? The florist said you never came in." "I wasn't feeling well," I answered. There was a brief pause. "Oh, okay, well, can you drop the samples off tomorrow?" "Of course." Not once did she ask what was wrong. That was unusual. The little girl who used to notice if I sounded tired over the phone had become a woman too busy to hear the silence between my words. Still, I convinced myself I was overreacting. People said careless things under stress. Wedding planning exhausted everyone. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe. Hope has a remarkable ability to explain away pain. 2 days later, Claire invited me to lunch. She chose an upscale restaurant downtown, where the average entree cost more than I used to spend feeding our family for an entire weekend. She arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a cream-colored blazer and speaking into a wireless headset. She smiled, hugged me with one arm, and finished her business call before sitting down. "I'm sorry," she said, "everything's crazy." "I know." For a while we talked about flowers, seating charts, and honeymoon plans. Then she looked at me carefully. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Anything." Please don't take this personally. Whenever a sentence begins that way, the ending is rarely kind. She folded her hands together. A lot of Daniel's professional contacts are coming. I nodded. I know. They're very polished. I imagine they are. She hesitated. I've been thinking maybe it would be better if you skipped the rehearsal dinner speeches. I wasn't planning to give one. Though, another pause. And maybe don't talk about when Dad worked construction. Some people misunderstand those kinds of stories. I stared at her. Misunderstand what? You know, she said carefully, people make assumptions. About honest work. She looked away instead of answering. For the first time in my life, I realized my daughter wasn't embarrassed by poverty. She was embarrassed that anyone might discover she hadn't always belonged to the world she now occupied. There is a difference. One is fear. The other is shame. I smiled gently. I've always been proud of your father. I know, Mom. Then why shouldn't everyone else know what kind of man he was? She sighed. Because people don't always understand. No, I answered quietly, sometimes they understand perfectly. Lunch ended politely. We hugged. She kissed my cheek. Anyone watching would have believed we had shared a lovely afternoon. Only the two of us knew how much distance had settled between us during those 73 minutes. That evening I opened an old cedar chest in my bedroom. Inside were dozens of memory boxes. Every school drawing Clea had ever made. Every Mother's Day card. Every report card. Every recital program. There was one crayon drawing from first grade that made me stop. It showed a little girl holding her mother's hand. Above us in uneven letters, Clea had written, "My mom is my hero because she always comes." I traced those words with my finger. Always comes. School plays. Soccer games. Parent conferences. Hospital visits. College move-in day. Apartment painting weekends. Job interviews. Broken relationships. Every single milestone. No matter how tired. No matter how worried. No matter what it cost. Parents rarely remember every sacrifice because sacrifice becomes routine. Children rarely remember because routine becomes invisible. The following Monday, Clea texted, "Can you stop by tomorrow? Need help organizing welcome bags." I replied immediately, "Of course." For 6 hours we folded tissue paper, tied ribbons, sorted handwritten itineraries, and packed small gifts for 182 guests. We worked almost silently. Around 4 in the afternoon, Daniel walked into the room. He glanced over the boxes. "Looks good." Clea smiled proudly. "Mum organized all of it." Daniel nodded. "Excellent." Then his phone buzzed. He answered it before saying another word. He walked away while still talking. I watched him disappear down the hallway. Clea noticed my expression. He's under a lot of pressure. I'm sure he is. He doesn't mean anything by it. I didn't say he did. She looked relieved. That was becoming our relationship. She defended things before I criticized them. As though somewhere inside herself she already knew. The wedding was 5 days away. On Wednesday afternoon I received a package. Inside was the pale blue dress Clea had chosen for me months earlier. There was no note. Just the dress. When I tried it on, I discovered it had been altered. The neckline had been raised. The sleeves lengthened. The style looked almost 20 years older than the version we'd originally selected together. I assumed there had been a mistake. I called the boutique. The manager checked the records. No mistake, Mrs. Hayes. The alterations were specifically requested by the bride. I thanked her and ended the call. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for a very long time. It wasn't about the dress. It was the realization that my own daughter had quietly changed how I would appear at her wedding, without mentioning it to me. As though I had become another decorative detail requiring adjustment. That evening, my sister Linda came over for coffee. She took one look at the dress hanging near the window. "What happened?" I explained. She listened without interrupting. Finally, she asked one question. "Elena, when was the last time Claire asked what you wanted?" I searched my memory. I couldn't answer. Because I honestly couldn't remember. Friday morning, the day before the wedding, I baked Claire's favorite cinnamon bread. I had made it every birthday since she turned 6. It had become our tradition. She loved it toasted with butter while opening gifts. I wrapped 2 fresh loaves in linen towels and drove to her apartment. Daniel answered the door. "Zoe's hi. I brought Claire something." He accepted the basket. "She's out with Victoria. I can wait." He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "I don't think today is a good day. I won't stay long." "Elena." It was the first time he had ever called me by my first name instead of Mrs. Hayes. His expression wasn't angry. It was uncomfortable. As though he had rehearsed what came next. "Claire asked me to talk to you." And something inside me became very still. "What about?" He looked toward the floor. "The wedding." I nodded slowly. "Go ahead." He inhaled deeply. "Claire feels that certain family dynamics have become stressful." "What family dynamics?" "She worries there could be awkward moments." "I don't understand." He finally looked into my eyes. "She thinks your presence might distract from the atmosphere she's trying to create." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Are you telling me my daughter doesn't want me at her wedding?" He closed his eyes briefly. "She thinks it's best. Not we. Not I." See, I could hear traffic outside. A dog barking somewhere down the street. The ticking clock inside the apartment. Amazing how ordinary the world remains while your heart quietly breaks. May I hear it from her? "I think this is easier." "For whom?" He had no answer. I smiled politely. "I'll leave the bread." He reached for the basket. Before handing it over, I looked down at the neatly folded towel covering the warm loaves. "Tell her they're still warm." Then I turned and walked back to my car. I had almost reached the driver's door when my phone vibrated. A text message. From Claire. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it already is. I love you. But I think it's better if you don't come tomorrow. Some people just wouldn't understand us." I stared at the screen. Not because of the invitation being taken away, but because of those last 6 words. Some people just wouldn't understand us. Us. As though I no longer belonged inside that word. I sat in my car for nearly an hour without starting the engine. Not crying. Not shouting. Just staring through the windshield while people came and went from nearby shops, completely unaware that, a few feet away, a mother had just discovered she no longer had a place at her only child's wedding. Eventually, I folded my phone, placed it in my purse and drove home. The house felt unusually quiet. Not because it was empty. It had been empty since David died. It felt quiet because I had spent months imagining that the following day would fill it with excitement. Instead, every carefully prepared detail suddenly had nowhere to go. The blue dress hung untouched in my bedroom. The wedding gift, a hand-carved walnut memory chest David and I had commissioned almost a year earlier, still sat wrapped in the corner of my living room. Inside it were dozens of family photographs, handwritten recipes, letters David had written to Claire when she was a little girl, and a sealed envelope addressed in my handwriting. "Open on your first wedding anniversary." I had spent nearly 6 months putting everything together. Now it looked like a package meant for someone else's family. That evening Linda arrived without calling. She took one look at my face. She did it. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Linda walked over and hugged me so tightly that neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, she whispered, "I'm so sorry." I smiled weakly. "Don't be." She pulled back. "What do you mean, don't be?" I've spent 35 years teaching Claire that love means showing up no matter what. And if I only love her when she makes good decisions, then I haven't actually taught her anything. Linda shook her head. "Alina, forgiveness and allowing yourself to be humiliated are not the same thing." She was right. I simply wasn't ready to admit it. That night I slept less than 2 hours. At 5:18 the next morning I woke up automatically. For almost 30 years, Saturdays had begun exactly that way whenever Claire had soccer tournaments, dance recitals, debate competitions, or college visits. My body still remembered how to prepare for her important days, even if I was no longer invited to them. I made coffee, fed the birds in the backyard, watered David's rose bushes, folded laundry that didn't need folding. Anything to keep my hands busy. Around 9 o'clock my phone began buzzing. Relatives were posting photographs. The florist unloading white peonies. The bridesmaids laughing in matching robes. Daniel standing with his groomsmen. Claire smiling in front of a makeup mirror. Everyone looked beautiful. Everyone looked happy. I pressed the heart button beneath each picture. Not because my heart felt light. Because I refused to become another source of bitterness on what should have been the happiest day of her life. At 10:42 my cousin Margaret called. "Alina, where are you?" "At home." "What do you mean at home?" "I wasn't invited." Silence. Long, stunned silence. I thought you were helping Claire get dressed." "So did I." Margaret inhaled sharply. "I had no idea." "I know. Should I say something?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Very." After hanging up, I turned my phone face down on the kitchen table. I didn't want updates anymore. Some truths become easier to carry when you stop watching them unfold. By noon, guests had begun arriving at the historic estate where the ceremony was being held. I knew the venue well. I'd visited it 7 different times during planning. I'd memorized the gardens, the stone fountain, the oak trees lining the entrance. I even knew exactly where the afternoon sunlight would fall across the ceremony chairs. Knowledge without belonging is a painful thing. Around 12:30 Linda called. "I'm outside." She walked in carrying a paper bag. "What is this?" "Lunch." "I'm not hungry." I didn't ask. We sat together at my kitchen table eating soup in almost complete silence. Sometimes the greatest kindness another person can offer is refusing to fill the room with unnecessary words. At exactly 1:57 p.m., according to the printed schedule I'd helped design, the ceremony was supposed to begin. I glanced at the clock, then deliberately looked away. That chapter of my life, I told myself, was over. Or so I believed. What I couldn't possibly know was that, only a few miles away, something entirely unexpected had just happened. As the string quartet finished the opening piece and nearly 200 guests settled into their seats, a black sedan slowly rolled through the front gates. It wasn't listed among the scheduled arrivals. The security staff exchanged puzzled looks. The driver stepped out first. Then he opened the rear door. An elderly gentleman in a dark charcoal suit emerged, straightened his tie, and quietly asked one simple question. "I'm looking for Mrs. Alina Hayes." The wedding coordinator frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, she isn't attending." The gentleman looked genuinely surprised. "She isn't?" "No." He paused for several seconds. "There must be some mistake." "I'm afraid not." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a cream-colored envelope with Alina Hayes written carefully across the front. I've traveled over 800 miles to deliver this to her personally. The coordinator apologized again. I'm sorry. So am I, the gentleman replied softly. Then he looked toward the ceremony space where music had already begun. I suppose I'll have to speak with the bride. Those nearby assumed he was another distant relative. No one recognized him. No one imagined why he had come. Least of all Claire. She was standing at the entrance with her father-in-law's arm linked through hers, preparing to walk down the aisle, completely unaware that within the next few minutes, the carefully constructed image she had spent years protecting was about to meet a truth she had never expected to face. Claire adjusted her veil one final time. The wedding photographer smiled. Perfect. The bridesmaids dabbed away happy tears. Daniel stood at the front of the garden, hands folded, smiling confidently as the quartet began the processional. Everything was exactly on schedule. Exactly as planned. Until the wedding coordinator hurried toward Daniel, with an expression that didn't belong on anyone's face during a ceremony. She leaned close enough that only he could hear. There's a gentleman insisting he needs to speak with the bride. Daniel frowned. Now, he says it's urgent. It can wait. I told him that. And he said it has already waited 39 years. Daniel looked confused. What does that even mean? I don't know. Before either of them could say anything else, the elderly man calmly walked toward the ceremony area. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. He wasn't forcing his way through anyone. His quiet confidence made people move aside without being asked. Nearly 200 guests instinctively turned to watch. The string quartet slowly stopped playing. Conversations faded. Even the photographer lowered his camera. The gentleman stopped a respectful distance from the front row. I'm terribly sorry for interrupting. His voice was steady. I have traveled a long way because I was told Mrs. Alina Hayes would be here today. Claire stepped forward. I'm her daughter. He smiled politely. Then perhaps you can help me. I'm Claire. He nodded once. I know who you are. She looked puzzled. My mother couldn't make it. The gentleman studied her face carefully. I've just been informed. I'm sorry for your trip. So am I. Another brief silence settled over the garden. Then he asked the question no one expected. May I ask why your mother isn't here? Claire shifted uncomfortably. It was a family decision. I see. His expression remained calm. I was hoping to thank her publicly. Claire blinked. For what? For changing my life. A ripple moved through the guests. People exchanged curious glances. Daniel stepped closer. I'm sorry, sir, and you are. The gentleman extended his hand. My name is Arthur Whitmore. The name meant nothing to most of the guests. But 3 people in the 4th row suddenly sat upright. One of Daniel's law partners whispered, Arthur Whitmore. Another answered quietly, It can't be. Claire noticed the reaction. I'm afraid I don't understand. Arthur smiled gently. That has happened many times over the years. He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully unfolded an old photograph. Its edges were worn from decades of being handled. This picture was taken in 1987. Claire looked down. The photograph showed a much younger woman standing beside a hospital bed. She recognized the face immediately. It's my mother. Arthur nodded. Yes. Claire frowned. Who are you to her? Arthur took a slow breath. 39 years ago, I was a frightened 28-year-old engineer whose wife had just died during childbirth. The entire garden became silent. I had lost my wife, my job, and almost every reason to continue living. He looked at the old photograph again. Your mother didn't know me. Then, We met because she volunteered every Thursday evening at County Memorial Hospital. Clea stared. My mother never worked at a hospital. No. Arthur smiled softly. She volunteered after finishing her full-time bookkeeping job. Clea looked confused. I've never heard about this. I imagine she never mentioned it. Arthur continued. One evening I told her I intended to leave the hospital and never come back. He paused. Your mother sat beside me for almost 3 hours. No one moved. No one spoke. She listened while I talked about failure, grief, fear, and the little baby girl I didn't believe I could raise alone. Arthur's voice became quieter. She never once tried to impress me. She never gave me a speech. She simply said. He smiled as though hearing Alina's voice again. The people we love don't stop needing us just because we're hurting. Clea's eyes widened. Arthur nodded. I went home. I raised my daughter. I rebuilt my career. I eventually started my own engineering company. He looked around the ceremony. 22 years later, that company employed over 4,000 people. Soft murmurs spread through the audience. Daniel's expression changed. He had finally recognized the name. Arthur Whitmore. Founder, philanthropist, recipient of multiple national business awards. A man whose leadership books were taught in executive seminars. Arthur continued quietly. People often ask me what changed my life. They expect me to mention a business decision, a mentor, an investment. They're always surprised when I tell them. He looked directly at Clea. It was your mother. Clea's face had gone completely pale. Arthur carefully folded the photographs. I searched for Alina Hayes for many years. I wanted to thank her. But every time I found an address, she'd already moved. He smiled sadly. 6 months ago, my daughter finally located her. I wrote asking whether I could attend your wedding. Clea swallowed. You'd asked my mother. Yes. Arthur reached into his pocket once more. This was her reply. He unfolded a neatly preserved handwritten letter. The first line says. His voice softened. If my daughter is beginning a new life, any friend of mine is welcome to celebrate with her. Arthur looked up. I accepted immediately. Another long silence followed. Then he added the sentence that seemed to stop time itself. I came here today because I believed the most important guest at this wedding would be the woman who quietly saved my life. He slowly looked toward the empty front row chair reserved for the bride's mother. It was still decorated with white roses. Still perfectly arranged. Still empty. Arthur's eyes rested on it for several seconds. Then he asked almost to himself. So where is Alina Hayes, really? No one answered him. Not immediately. The silence became almost unbearable. The guests who had spent the last 20 minutes chatting about careers, vacations, and business deals now found themselves staring at an empty white chair that suddenly seemed far more important than the elaborate floral arrangements surrounding it. Clea slowly turned toward Daniel. He couldn't meet her eyes. Victoria looked down at the ground. Even the officiant quietly stepped back, sensing that whatever was happening had become far more significant than the ceremony itself. Arthur gently folded Alina's letter and slipped it back into the envelope. I apologize, he said. I never intended to interrupt your wedding. His voice carried no accusation. No anger. Only disappointment. I simply wanted the woman who changed my life to know that the life she saved became a good one. He smiled faintly. My daughter became a pediatric surgeon. A few people quietly gasped. My son teaches mathematics. I have 4 grandchildren. I've lived long enough to watch them grow. He looked once more at the empty chair. Every birthday, every graduation, every Christmas morning. He paused. They all exist because one exhausted young mother sat beside a stranger who believed his life was over. Clea covered her mouth. She had never heard that story. Not once. Arthur continued. Your mother refused every attempt I made to repay her. I offered money. She declined. I offered scholarships in her name. She declined. I asked whether I could publicly recognize her. She smiled and said something I'll never forget. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering her words. If you really want to thank me, then be the kind of person who notices the people everyone else overlooks. The garden remained perfectly still. Arthur looked around at the guests. I have tried to live by those words for almost 4 decades. Then his eyes returned to Clea. And today. He hesitated. I seem to have overlooked someone myself. Clea's voice trembled. What do you mean? I assumed a daughter who spoke so lovingly about her mother in every letter would naturally have her sitting beside her today. Clea whispered, Zai, but no words came. Arthur didn't press her. He simply nodded. I understand that families are complicated. Mine certainly was. But I also know this. He glanced toward the empty chair one last time. Regret has a very long memory. Those words landed with a weight no dramatic accusation ever could. One of Daniel's senior partners quietly leaned toward another executive. I've met Arthur Whitmore twice. So have I. I've never seen him speak like this. Across the aisle, Clea's maid of honor quietly wiped away tears. Not because of Arthur. Because she suddenly remembered every time Clea had jokingly complained that her mother was old-fashioned or embarrassing. Those jokes no longer sounded harmless. Daniel finally stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore. Arthur looked at him politely. I'm deeply sorry for the misunderstanding. Arthur gave a small nod. So am I. Daniel hesitated. If we can contact Elena, perhaps. Arthur gently interrupted him. No. Daniel looked surprised. No. You should invite her because she's your family. He smiled kindly. Not because I'm here. Daniel lowered his eyes. Arthur continued. Gratitude borrowed from another person's reputation isn't gratitude at all. Several guests quietly looked away. The sentence had found its target. Clea suddenly handed her bouquet to her maid of honor. Without saying a word, she reached into the small clutch resting on a nearby chair and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly, she pressed the wrong contact twice before finally finding Mom. She called. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Clea tried again immediately. Again. Voicemail. Linda had silenced Elena's phone while they sat together at home drinking tea, determined that no wedding updates would disturb an already broken heart. Clea looked helplessly toward Arthur. I can't reach her. Arthur's expression remained gentle. I hope you do. He adjusted his jacket. I believe my work here is finished. He turned to leave. Halfway down the aisle he stopped. Without looking back, he said quietly, one last thing. Everyone waited. When history remembers successful people. He smiled faintly. It usually remembers buildings, awards, companies, or fortunes. He looked toward the empty chair once again. But if you ask the people whose lives were truly changed. His voice softened. They almost always remember a person who simply chose to care. Then he walked slowly toward the exit. No applause followed. None was appropriate. The silence he left behind said far more than applause ever could. For nearly a full minute, no one moved. Finally, the officiant looked gently at Clea. What would you like to do? Clea stared at the aisle where Arthur had disappeared. Then she looked at the empty chair reserved for her mother. The chair she herself had insisted would remain empty. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the wedding no longer felt like the most important event of the day. Somewhere across town sat the woman who had quietly built the life Clea now enjoyed. And she was sitting there alone. Clea opened her eyes slowly. The makeup artist had spent nearly 2 hours creating a flawless look that morning. Now tears were quietly tracing paths through it. She didn't seem to notice. She looked toward Daniel. "I need to go." He stared at her. "The ceremony." "I know. The guests are here." "I know. The officiant." "I know." Her voice remained calm. "But my mother is sitting somewhere believing I chose this day over her." Daniel didn't answer. Because she had. Clea turned toward the guests. "I'm sorry. It wasn't a speech. Just 2 words." Then she stepped off the aisle, gathered the front of her wedding dress, and walked quickly toward the waiting car outside. For several seconds, no one moved. Finally, Daniel followed. Not running. Simply walking after the woman he loved, realizing that some moments cannot be managed like legal negotiations. The reception staff looked confused. The musicians quietly lowered their instruments. Guests remained seated, speaking in hushed voices. No one complained. No one demanded refunds or explanations. Instead, conversations began changing. People stopped discussing the menu and started talking about their own parents. One executive quietly admitted he hadn't visited his father in almost a year. Another guest deleted a business email he had been about to send and instead typed a message to his mother. Arthur's words had done something unusual. They hadn't embarrassed anyone. They had reminded people. Across town, Linda was washing the teacups when someone knocked gently on Elena's front door. Neither woman expected visitors. Linda opened it. Clea stood there, still wearing her wedding dress. Her veil had been removed. The expensive satin hem was stained with dirt from running across the parking area. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Linda's expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" Clea's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I came to see my mom." Linda didn't move aside. "You already saw her yesterday." Clea lowered her eyes. "I know. And you told her not to come." Another quiet nod. "I know." Linda looked at her for several seconds. Then she stepped aside without another word. Clea walked into the house she had grown up in. Everything looked exactly as she remembered. The grandfather clock. The framed family photographs. The quilt folded over the living room chair. Even the faint smell of cinnamon bread still lingered in the air. She found Elena sitting on the back porch. Her mother wasn't crying. She was trimming David's rose bushes. One careful stem at a time. As though it were an ordinary Saturday. Elena heard footsteps. She turned. For a second she simply looked. Not at the wedding dress. Not at the makeup. At her daughter's face. Clea's lips trembled. "I'm sorry." Elena set the gardening shears down gently. Neither woman moved. Finally Clea whispered, "I didn't realize." Elena smiled sadly. "No, you knew." Clea's shoulders dropped. "You're right. I did." There was no anger in Elena's voice. Only truth. Clea slowly walked closer. "I kept telling myself I was protecting my future." Elena listened. "I thought people would judge me. I thought they would think we weren't sophisticated enough." A tear rolled down Clea's cheek. And somewhere along the way, she looked around the small porch where she had spent so much of her childhood. "I started believing that the people who made me who I am were somehow less important than the people I wanted to impress." Elena remained silent. Because apologies often continue only when they aren't interrupted. Clea wiped her eyes. "Do you remember when I was 9? Elena nodded slowly. "The spelling bee." I forgot every word. You didn't. I thought I had. Clea smiled through tears. I was looking for you. You were sitting in the third row. You smiled. And then I remembered every answer. She looked directly into her mother's eyes. Today, her voice broke. I looked for you. The words hung between them. Elena's own eyes filled for the first time all day. Clea took another step. I finally understood what that empty chair actually meant. Silence. Then Elena quietly asked, "Why did you really come?" Clea answered honestly. Not because Mr. Whitmore came. Not because the guests heard what he said. She shook her head. I came because I suddenly realized that if today ended without you. She struggled to finish. Every anniversary would remind me of the chair I left empty. Elena looked at her daughter for a long time. Finally she stood. She reached out. Not dramatically. Simply placing one hand against Clea's, cheek exactly as she had done when Clea was a little girl, with scraped knees and broken confidence. I forgive you. Clea burst into tears. But, Elena continued softly, forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Clea nodded. I know. We can't pretend yesterday didn't happen. I don't want to. We'll have to rebuild trust. I will. Slowly. I understand. Elena smiled faintly. Good. Because real healing isn't built in a single conversation. It's built in hundreds of ordinary days afterward. Clea quietly rested her forehead against her mother's shoulder. Neither woman spoke again for several minutes. There was nothing left to explain. Only something left to rebuild. Late that afternoon, the ceremony finally began. Not at the original scheduled time. Not according to the carefully printed itinerary. Guests took their seats once more. This time, before anyone walked down the aisle, Clea quietly crossed to the front row. She took her mother's hand. Then, without saying a word, she walked with Elena to the seat that had been waiting all day. No announcement was made. No one applauded. Arthur Whitmore, standing quietly near the back, simply smiled to himself. The empty chair was empty no longer. And somehow that mattered more than every flower, every decoration, every photograph, and every carefully planned detail combined. Years later, people rarely remembered the delay. They rarely remembered the menu or the music. But those who attended never forgot the lesson. Families don't usually fall apart because of one cruel sentence. They drift apart one small compromise at a time, one moment of choosing appearances over gratitude, one decision to value status more than sacrifice. That is the real system. And unless someone has the courage to stop it, the pattern quietly repeats itself from one generation to the next. Tell me in the comments, if you had been in Elena's place, would you have returned to the wedding or would you have stayed home? Subscribe to Revenge Cold Stories, and I'll see you in the next one.